Some people are not invited into a house. They are let in by mistake, and yet somehow, they become the reason it feels alive again. The storm had already swallowed the road when Elena Carter reached the iron gates, her coat soaked through, her breath visible in the freezing air as she stood no more than 10 feet from a world she did not belong to. Whitmore Manor loomed behind the bars like a silent judge, its tall windows dim, its stone walls holding years of quiet grief. And for a moment, she almost turned away, almost accepted that there were places a woman like her was never meant to enter, but the wind howled harder, and something in her refused to break. When the gates finally creaked open, it was not kindness that allowed her in, but duty, and duty had a colder face than cruelty. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood in the entrance hall as she was led inside, tall, still, his expression carved from something far older than indifference, his eyes passing over her soaked figure not with concern, but with calculation, as though measuring whether she was worth the inconvenience. She lowered her gaze, not out of submission, but because she understood immediately that this was a man who did not tolerate intrusion, and yet she had become one. "You may stay," he said at last, his voice quiet, controlled, carrying through the vast hall without effort. "But only until the storm passes." And though the words offered shelter, they held no warmth, no promise beyond necessity. She nodded once, her fingers tightening around the worn fabric of her bag, offering no explanation, no plea, as if she had already accepted that this roof was not hers to claim. The servants moved carefully around them, their glances fleeting, their silence practiced, as though the house itself demanded restraint, and somewhere deep within its walls, the echo of footsteps seemed louder than it should have been. Her room was small compared to the grandeur below, but warmer than anything she had known in days, and when the door closed behind her, she allowed herself a single breath, slow and unsteady, before setting her things down with deliberate care, as if afraid even her presence might leave a mark. Downstairs, Alexander remained where he stood long after she was gone, his gaze fixed not on the door she had disappeared through, but on the space she had occupied, something unsettled flickering beneath the surface of his composure before he turned away as though it had never existed. The storm raged harder through the night, pressing against the windows, whispering against the stone, but inside the manor, something subtle had shifted, something no one spoke of and no one dared to name, and though neither of them knew it yet, the moment she stepped across that threshold had already begun to unravel a silence that had held the house captive for years. Morning arrived without sunlight. Only a dim gray glow pressed weakly against the tall windows as if even the sky hesitated to fully touch the manor, and Elena woke before the house did, not out of habit, but because sleep had come lightly, like something borrowed and not meant to be kept. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a moment, listening to the silence, noticing how it was not empty but heavy, layered with something unspoken that lingered in the walls. And when she finally stepped into the corridor, her footsteps felt too loud against the polished floor, though no one appeared to hear them. Downstairs, the grand hall stood exactly as it had the night before, untouched in a way that suggested it had been waiting, and she moved carefully through it, her presence cautious, almost apologetic, as though she might disturb something fragile. In the far corner, a single candle had been left burning, its flames steady despite the draft, and without thinking she approached it, adjusting the wick slightly, a small act, insignificant, yet it changed the way the light spread across the stone, softening the sharp edges of shadow. Alexander noticed the difference immediately. He stood at the threshold of his study, watching from a distance without announcing himself, his gaze fixed not on her face, but on the way she moved through the space, not claiming it, not altering it boldly, but touching it just enough to shift its balance. He had spent years ensuring nothing changed within these walls, that every object remained where it belonged, that every room reflected the order he could control, and yet this woman, who had asked for nothing, who had been given only temporary shelter, was altering the atmosphere without even seeming to realize it. She turned slightly then, sensing something rather than seeing it, and their eyes met across the hall for a brief moment that stretched longer than it should have, her expression calm, unreadable, as if she had already accepted whatever judgment he might pass, and he found himself unable to speak. unable to return to the cold detachment that had come so easily the night before. Instead, he stepped forward at last, his voice measured, careful. You should remain in the East Wing. The rest of the house is not for guests. And the words sounded harsher than intended, though they were not untrue. She inclined her head once in acknowledgement. No argument, no disappointment, only quiet understanding. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. As she moved past him, the faint scent of rain still clinging to her clothes, he became aware of something unfamiliar, something he had not felt in years. A subtle awareness of another presence that did not intrude, did not demand, but existed in a way that made the space feel less hollow. Throughout the day, the manor remained as silent as ever, yet the servants found themselves moving with a strange sense of ease, their steps less guarded, their voices slightly less hushed, as if the tension that had long defined the household had loosened by a fraction, and no one spoke of it, no one dared to. But they all felt it. By evening, the storm had not yet passed, the wind still pressing against the windows with quiet persistence, and Elena stood once more by the glass, looking out into the gray distance as though measuring something only she could see, while behind her, unseen, Alexander paused in the doorway again, watching, not with suspicion this time, but with something far more dangerous, something that began not as interest, but as the quiet realization that her presence had already begun to change things he had believed were unchangeable. By the third morning, the storm had softened but had not yet released its hold, the snow outside lying deep across the grounds in a quiet, endless white that seemed to erase the world beyond the gates. And Elena had already begun to move through the manor with a rhythm that did not belong to a guest, but did not presume to be anything more. She rose early again, long before the servants gathered, and this time she did not hesitate at the grand hall, her steps still careful but no longer uncertain, as though she had accepted the temporary nature of her presence and found a strange kind of peace within it. In the dining room, a single place had been set, as always, untouched, the long table stretching empty into shadow, and she paused there for a moment, studying the arrangement, noticing the precision, the absence of variation, the quiet discipline that spoke more of solitude than order. Without asking permission, without even seeming to decide, she adjusted one detail, only one, moving the second chair slightly closer, not enough to suggest expectation, only enough to soften the distance. And then she stepped back as if nothing had changed at all. When Alexander entered later, he stopped without meaning to, his gaze catching on that subtle shift. The space altered in a way so small it could have been dismissed, yet it lingered in his mind longer than it should have, because it implied something he had long refused to acknowledge, the possibility of presence beside him. He said nothing, of course, and the chair remained where it was, neither corrected nor acknowledged. And when he took his seat, the silence felt different, not broken, but observed. Throughout the day, Elena found small ways to occupy herself that required no permission, tending to a neglected arrangement of flowers near the east wing, brushing dust from a windowsill that had been overlooked, actions so quiet and unobtrusive they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him. Alexander became aware of her not as an interruption, but as a pattern, something that moved through his carefully ordered world and shifted it by degrees too subtle to resist. He told himself it was temporary, that the storm would pass, that she would leave, and everything would return to its proper state. Yet the certainty of that thought no longer brought relief. Late that afternoon, as the fading light turned the snow outside a pale silver, Elena stood once more near the tall windows of the east corridor, her reflection faint against the glass, her posture still, composed, as though she had learned long ago how to exist without demanding space. This time, when Alexander approached, he did not remain in the doorway, and when he spoke, his voice carried less distance than before. You are not required to concern yourself with the house. And though the words were meant to re-establish a boundary, they lacked the firmness they once held. She turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze with that same quiet steadiness, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, not familiarity, not yet, but recognition, the kind that does not need explanation. I know, she said softly, her voice calm, untroubled. I simply do not know how to do. Nothing. And there was no apology in it, only truth. He studied her then, more closely than he had allowed himself before, noticing not her appearance, but the absence of expectation in her expression, the way she stood without seeking approval or fearing rejection, and it unsettled him in a way he could not define. As evening settled over the manor once again, the storm finally began to ease, the wind fading into a distant hush, and yet within those walls, something continued to shift, something that had nothing to do with weather or circumstance. And as Alexander stood alone later that night, the echo of her words lingering in his thoughts, he realized with a quiet certainty that her presence was no longer something he could dismiss as temporary, because even before she left, she had already begun to change what would remain after she was gone. The storm ended without ceremony, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unfamiliar, as though the world outside Whitmore Manor had paused and forgotten to resume. And for the first time since her arrival, Elena stepped beyond the east wing without hesitation, drawn not by curiosity, but by a quiet sense that the house itself had begun to recognize her presence. The snow stretched across the grounds in a smooth, unbroken expanse, reflecting the pale winter light into the tall windows, and inside, that light reached places it had not touched in years, softening corners that had long remained in shadow. Alexander noticed at the moment he entered the main corridor, the subtle difference in how the air felt, not warmer, not brighter, but less burdened, as though something unseen had shifted just enough to be felt, but not named. He found her in the library, a room he rarely allowed others to enter, standing near the shelves with a book held gently in her hands, not reading, simply tracing the spine as if acknowledging its presence, and the sight of her there should have unsettled him more than it did, yet instead, he felt an unexpected stillness, as though the intrusion he had once guarded against no longer carried the same weight. "This room is not part of the East Wing," he said, his voice measured, though lacking its former sharpness, and she turned toward him without surprise, as if she had sensed him long before he spoke. "I know," she replied softly, closing the book with care. "I will leave if you wish." And there was no resistance in her tone, no challenge, only a simple willingness to respect the boundary he had drawn. He studied her for a moment, longer than necessary, noticing how she did not move immediately, how she waited not out of defiance but out of patience, as though giving him the space to decide, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself stepping aside instead of forward. "You may stay," he said after a pause, the words quieter than before, almost thoughtful, and something in the room shifted again, subtle yet undeniable. She inclined her head slightly, accepting the permission without acknowledgement of its significance, and returned the book to its place with the same care she had shown in every small action since her arrival. As the afternoon passed, they remained in the same space without speaking, the silence no longer heavy but shared, a quiet coexistence that neither had anticipated. And when the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, Alexander became aware of how natural it felt to have another presence within those walls, not as an obligation, not as an interruption, but as something that filled the emptiness he had long convinced himself was necessary. Later that evening, as the servants prepared the usual solitary meal, he paused at the entrance to the dining room, his gaze drawn once again to the second chair, still positioned slightly closer than before, and this time, he did not hesitate. "Have another place set," he instructed, his voice steady, though the decision carried a weight he had not expected. And when Elena entered moments later, she stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes taking in the change with quiet understanding, not surprise, not gratitude, but something far more restrained, something that mirrored his own uncertainty. They sat across from one another in a silence that was no longer empty. The distance between them measured not in feet, but in something far more delicate, and as the evening unfolded with only the faint sound of cutlery and the distant whisper of wind against the windows, Alexander realized that the line he had drawn between obligation and something else had begun to blur, not with force, not with intention, but with a quiet persistence that neither of them had chosen, yet neither seemed willing to resist. The first shared meal passed without conversation, yet it did not feel empty. And that alone unsettled Alexander more than silence ever had, because silence had always been his choice. his shield. But this was something different, something that existed between them without demand or expectation. And as the evening drew to a close, Elena rose quietly from her seat, offering a small nod that carried neither formality nor familiarity before leaving the room as she always did, without lingering. Without assuming she was meant to stay, he watched her go longer than he intended, his hand still resting lightly against the table as though he had forgotten to move. And when the door closed behind her, the space she left behind did not return to what it had been before. In the days that followed, the manor settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, yet neither disrupted, where her presence remained unobtrusive but undeniable, woven into the quiet patterns of the house in ways that did not challenge his authority but gradually reshaped its atmosphere. She did not seek conversation, yet she listened when spoken to, her responses measured, thoughtful, never overstepping. And it was this restraint that drew his attention more than anything else, because it revealed a strength that did not need to be declared. One afternoon, as the winter light filtered faintly through the high windows, Alexander entered the study to find a small fire already lit, its warmth steady, not excessive, the kind of detail his staff would never presume without instruction. And for a moment he stood still, his gaze moving from the quiet flame to the empty room, aware without needing to ask who had done it. Later, he found her in the corridor, her hands folded lightly before her as she paused near the tall windows, and though he had no intention of speaking, the words came regardless. "You should not concern yourself with such tasks." His tone calm, but less distant than before. She turned toward him with that same composed expression, her voice soft but certain. It did not seem right to leave it cold. And there was no explanation beyond that, no attempt to justify her actions, only a simple statement that carried a quiet understanding he could not dismiss. He studied her for a moment, noticing how easily she spoke truth without pressing it upon him, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he did not correct her, did not reinforce the boundary he had once insisted upon, instead allowing the moment to settle into something unspoken. As evening approached, the air within the manor felt subtly different again, not warmer in temperature, but less rigid, as though the walls themselves had begun to release the tension they had held for so long. And when they found themselves once more in the dining room, seated across from one another in that same measured distance, Alexander became aware of something he had not felt in years, a quiet anticipation, not of conversation, but of presence. This time, when their eyes met briefly across the table, neither looked away immediately, and though no words followed, the silence carried a new weight, not empty, not heavy, but alive with something neither of them had yet named. Later that night, as he stood alone in the dimly lit study, the fire casting soft shadows against the walls, Alexander realized with a clarity that unsettled him deeply that the changes within the manor were no longer subtle, they were deliberate, shaped not by command or necessity, but by the quiet, consistent presence of a woman who had asked for nothing and yet had begun to alter everything. And for the first time, the thought of her leaving did not bring relief, but something far more dangerous, something that lingered in the silence long after the fire had burned low. The nights grew quieter after that, not because the house returned to its old stillness, but because the silence had changed its nature, no longer pressing down like a weight, but settling gently, like something that no longer needed to be defended against. And Elena began to notice it in the small hours when sleep did not come easily, when the corridors stretched long and dim beneath candlelight, and the air carried that faint, lingering warmth that had not existed before her arrival. She did not wander without reason, yet sometimes she found herself moving through the manor simply to feel the space, to understand the rhythm of a place that had once been closed to her. And one such night, as the clock marked a late hour, she paused outside the study door, drawn not by sound, but by the quiet presence within. Alexander had not retired, and the low glow of firelight spilled beneath the door, steady and unmoving, as though time itself had slowed in that room. She hesitated only a moment before stepping away, not wishing to intrude, yet the soft creak of the floor betrayed her movement, and from within, his voice came, calm, but aware, "You are not asleep." And it was not a question. She stopped, her hand resting lightly against the cool wall, considering whether to answer. And after a brief silence, she replied, "No." Her voice quiet, unguarded in a way it had not been before. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest he was deciding something. And then, "Come in." The words spoken without command, without expectation, but with something far more unfamiliar, something close to invitation. She opened the door slowly, the warm light of the study wrapping around her as she stepped inside, her gaze adjusting to the soft flicker of the fire. And for a moment, neither spoke. He stood near the hearth, one hand resting against the mantel, his posture composed. Yet there was a subtle shift in the way he regarded her, not as a guest, not as an obligation, but as someone whose presence he had begun to accept without resistance. "You should rest," he said after a moment, though the words lacked insistence, as though he no longer believed in enforcing them. She inclined her head slightly, but did not move toward the door, instead letting her gaze settle briefly on the fire, its steady glow reflecting faintly in her eyes. "It is difficult," she admitted, not elaborating, not offering explanation. And yet the simplicity of the truth carried more weight than any confession. He watched her then, more closely than before, noticing the absence of complaint in her tone, the quiet endurance that did not seek sympathy. And something within him shifted again, something he had long kept carefully contained. "The house is quieter than it once was," he said, the words chosen with care, as though testing their meaning as he spoke them. She glanced at him then, a faint understanding in her expression. "It does not feel empty," she replied, and for a moment, the room held that statement in silence, as if acknowledging something neither had intended to say aloud. He turned slightly, his gaze moving to the fire as if it offered some form of distance. Yet the truth of her words lingered, undeniable, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, stripped of the distance he had once relied upon. "No," he said quietly, "it does not." And in that simple agreement, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need to be defined to be understood. The fire burned steadily between them, casting long shadows that no longer felt cold. And as the hours stretched on, neither rushed to leave. Neither felt the need to retreat behind the boundaries that had once been so clearly drawn. And though nothing had been declared, nothing had been asked, the space between them had shifted once more, narrowing in a way that could not be undone, leaving behind a quiet certainty that whatever had begun within those walls was no longer bound by obligation alone. Something had changed after that night in the study, though neither of them spoke of it. And yet it revealed itself in the smallest details, in the way Elena no longer paused at the threshold of a room before entering, and in the way Alexander no longer noticed her presence as something separate from the house itself, but as part of its quiet rhythm. The mornings no longer felt as heavy, and though the winter still held the land in its cold grasp, the light seemed to reach further into the manor, touching surfaces that had long remained untouched. And with it came a subtle shift in the way the servants moved, less cautious, less burdened, as though the air itself had grown easier to breathe. Elena continued her quiet routines, never overstepping, never seeking acknowledgement, yet her presence left traces. A book returned to its proper place, a window unlatched to let in fresh air, a small arrangement of flowers placed where once there had been none, and each change was so slight it could have been dismissed. Yet together they formed something undeniable. Alexander found himself noticing these details more than he intended, his gaze lingering on the smallest alterations, his thoughts returning to them long after he had left the room. And though he told himself it was merely observation, a habit of control, there was a growing awareness beneath it, something far less certain, something that did not fit within the structure he had built around his life. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt at the edges of the grounds, revealing patches of earth beneath, he stepped outside for the first time in days, the cold air sharp, but no longer biting. And he found her there, standing near the far edge of the garden, her coat drawn close around her, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though she were measuring the distance to something unseen. He approached without announcing himself, his footsteps muted against the damp ground. And when he came to stand beside her, she did not startle, only shifted slightly to acknowledge his presence. "The storm is ending," he said, his voice quieter in the open air, as though the space required less restraint. She nodded, her eyes still fixed ahead. Yes, she replied softly. And there was something in the simplicity of her answer that carried more meaning than the words themselves. He followed her gaze then, noticing the faint line where the snow gave way to the dark earth, the boundary between what had been and what would come next, and for a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but shared. "You will leave when the roads are clear," he said after a pause, the statement measured, as though it were something that needed to be acknowledged, and though the words were expected, they lingered in the air with a weight neither of them could ignore. Elena lowered her gaze slightly, her hands resting still at her sides. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady, without hesitation, without regret, and yet there was something unspoken beneath it, something that neither questioned nor explained. He studied her then, searching for something more, some indication that the thought of leaving mattered to her, but her expression remained composed, her acceptance quiet and complete, and it unsettled him in a way he had not anticipated. They stood there a moment longer before she turned back toward the manor, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, as though nothing had shifted at all. And yet as Alexander watched her walk away, he became aware of a growing tension beneath his calm, something that had begun to take shape without his permission. By evening, the snow had receded further, the path leading away from the manor slowly reappearing, and with it came the quiet certainty that her time within those walls was nearing its end. And as he stood alone once more in the dim light of the study, the fire burning low, Alexander realized with a clarity that could no longer be dismissed that the thought of her leaving did not restore order as it should have, but instead left behind a silence he was no longer certain he could endure. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet inevitability, as though the world beyond Whitmore Manor had begun to reclaim what had been temporarily suspended, and Elena moved through the house with the same calm presence, though something in her manner had grown more measured, more deliberate, as if she were already preparing herself for departure without allowing it to show. The snow had nearly vanished from the grounds now, leaving behind damp earth and narrow paths that stretched outward, beyond the gates, and with each passing morning, the distance between staying and leaving grew smaller, more defined, until it could no longer be ignored. Alexander became increasingly aware of it in ways he could not escape, in the sound of footsteps that would soon no longer echo in the corridors, in the subtle changes that had taken root and would remain even after she was gone, and in the silence that seemed to gather itself again, waiting patiently to return. One evening, as the last light faded behind the hills, Elena stood once more by the tall window in the main corridor, her gaze fixed outward, her posture still, as though committing the view to memory. And when Alexander approached, he did not speak immediately, his presence announced only by the faint shift in the air between them. "The roads will be clear by morning," he said at last, his voice steady, though quieter than it had ever been, and the words carried with them a finality neither could pretend not to hear. She nodded slowly, her eyes remaining on the horizon for a moment longer before she turned to face him, and in that brief movement, something in her expression softened, not with regret, but with a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. "Then I will leave," she said, her voice calm, as though she had accepted this outcome long before it had been spoken aloud. The simplicity of her response unsettled him more than resistance ever could have, and for a moment, he found himself searching for something to say, something to alter the course that had already been set, but the words did not come. Or perhaps he did not yet know how to speak them. Instead, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried both acknowledgement and distance, and she returned it with the same quiet composure that had defined her presence from the beginning. The evening passed without further mention of her departure, yet everything within the manor seemed to hold a different weight, as though each moment had become more significant simply because it would not be repeated. At dinner, the second place was set as it had been for days now, but the silence between them had shifted once more, no longer tentative, no longer uncertain, but filled with something unspoken that neither dared to disturb. Their glances lingered a fraction longer, their movements slowed by an awareness that had not existed before, and though no words were exchanged, the space between them felt closer than ever. Later that night, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, Elena returned to her room, her belongings few, her preparations simple, and yet each small action carried a weight that had not been there before, as though she were not merely leaving a place, but stepping away from something that had begun to take shape within it. Across the manor, Alexander remained awake, the fire in his study burning low, his thoughts restless in a way that defied the control he had long maintained. And as the hours passed, the realization grew clearer, sharper, until it could no longer be ignored, that her departure would not restore what had been, but would instead leave behind an absence far greater than anything he had known before. And for the first time, the certainty of that absence did not bring him peace, but a quiet, undeniable sense that something essential was about to be lost. Morning arrived too quietly, as though the manor itself had chosen not to disturb the moment it could not prevent, and Elena woke before the light had fully reached her window, her eyes opening not with reluctance, but with a calm acceptance that settled over her like the last trace of winter fading from the ground. She sat for a moment in stillness, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if allowing herself one final pause before movement became inevitable. And when she rose, she did so with the same quiet grace that had defined her presence from the beginning, leaving nothing behind that did not belong to her. The corridors felt different as she walked through them, not colder, not empty, but aware, as though every step carried a memory that had not existed before her arrival. And she did not rush, did not hesitate, simply moved forward with a steady rhythm that neither clung nor withdrew. Downstairs, the house had already begun its morning routine, though the sounds were softer, restrained, as if even the servants sensed that something unspoken was drawing to a close. And when she entered the main hall, her gaze lifted once more to the tall windows where the first clear light of day revealed the open path beyond the gates. No longer hidden, no longer delayed. Alexander was already there. He stood near the entrance, his posture composed, his expression unreadable, yet there was a stillness about him that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with what he could not yet say. For a moment, neither moved. The distance between them measured not in steps, but in everything that had passed in silence between those walls. And then she inclined her head slightly, a gesture that held no formality, only acknowledgement. "The roads are clear," he said, his voice steady, though quieter than before, as if the words carried more weight now than they had the night before. "Yes," she answered, her tone gentle, certain, and there was nothing more to add, nothing left to explain. The carriage had been prepared without discussion, waiting beyond the doors, its presence a final confirmation that the moment had arrived, and yet neither of them moved toward it immediately, as though the simple act of stepping forward would set something irreversible into motion. "You will be safe on the road," he said after a moment, the words chosen carefully, though they did not quite reach what he intended. She nodded, her gaze steady. "I have been safe here," she replied, and the quiet truth of it lingered between them, heavier than anything else that had been spoken. Something in his expression shifted then, subtle but undeniable, as though the words had reached a place he had long kept closed, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might speak again, might alter the course that had already been set, but the silence returned before the thought could take form. She stepped past him then, her movement unhurried, her presence as composed as it had always been, and when the doors opened, the cold morning air met her without resistance, clear and unyielding. She did not look back immediately, not out of indifference, but because she understood that some moments could not be held without losing their meaning. And when she finally did, her gaze met his one last time across the threshold, not asking, not expecting, only acknowledging what had been, what had changed, and what would remain unspoken. Then she turned away, stepping toward the waiting carriage, leaving behind a space that did not close behind her, a silence that did not return to what it had been, and within the manor, as the doors shut once more, Alexander remained where he stood, the absence already settling into the walls, no longer distant, no longer manageable, but immediate, undeniable, and far deeper than anything he had ever allowed himself to face. The sound of the carriage wheels faded slowly beyond the gates, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet persistence that made its absence feel heavier than its presence had been, and Alexander remained standing in the entrance hall long after the doors had closed, his gaze fixed on the space where she had last stood, as though the memory of it had yet to settle into something he could accept. The house, once held together by silence, began to return to it in a way that felt different. Now, not controlled, not chosen, but hollow, as if something essential had been removed without warning. He turned at last, his steps measured as always, yet there was a slight hesitation in them, a pause that had never existed before, and as he moved through the corridors, the changes she had made revealed themselves not as disruptions, but as absences. Small details that remained, but no longer carried the same quiet intention behind them. The second chair in the dining room still stood closer than it had before, yet now it felt out of place, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer belonged to a shared presence. The fire in the study burned as it always had, yet its warmth seemed insufficient, unable to reach the corners that had once felt softened by her presence. Even the light through the tall windows appeared unchanged, yet it no longer settled the same way. As though it too had lost something it could not name, the servants moved as they always had, efficient, careful, yet their quiet exchanges lacked the ease that had briefly taken root, and though no one spoke of her departure, it lingered in the air, in the spaces between footsteps, in the rooms that now felt larger than they had before. By afternoon, Alexander found himself in the library, standing near the same shelves where he had first seen her, his hand resting lightly against the spine of a book he had no intention of reading. And for a moment, he allowed himself to remain still, to acknowledge the shift he could no longer ignore. "It does not feel empty," she had said, and the truth of those words returned now with a clarity that cut through the quiet, because without her, the absence was no longer something he could dismiss, but something that defined the space itself. He moved then, crossing the room with a purpose he did not fully understand, his gaze drawn to the window where the horizon stretched beyond the grounds, and for the first time in years, the distance beyond his own estate did not feel irrelevant, but necessary. The thought came without warning, without preparation, yet it settled into place with an undeniable certainty that her presence had not been temporary in the way he had believed, that what she had left behind was not something the house could return from, because it had already been changed. Outside, the road stretched clear beneath the pale sky, the last traces of snow melting into the earth, and somewhere beyond it, she continued forward, carrying nothing with her that belonged to him, and yet leaving behind something he could no longer ignore. He stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in around him, not as it once had, but with a different weight, one that demanded recognition rather than control. And when he finally turned from the window, the decision had already begun to form, not as a sudden impulse, but as a quiet understanding that remaining where he was would no longer restore what had been lost. The house behind him remained still, unchanged in structure, yet altered in every way that mattered. And for the first time, Alexander Whitmore stepped away from the life he had carefully preserved, not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because something far deeper had taken root, something that could not be ignored, and would not allow him to remain where he was any longer. He did not announce his departure, and perhaps that was the first true break from the man he had been, because Alexander Whitmore had always moved with certainty, with structure, with decisions made long before they were spoken. Yet this time, there was no formal command, no elaborate preparation, only a quiet series of actions that unfolded with a clarity he did not question. By midday, the carriage was ready, not as it had been for her, arranged with careful distance, but as something more immediate, more purposeful, and the servants watched in silence as he crossed the hall, his coat drawn close against the lingering chill, his expression composed yet altered in a way they could not name. The manor stood behind him as it always had, unchanged in its grandeur, yet no longer holding him in the same way. And for a brief moment, he paused at the threshold, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement, as though recognizing that what he left behind would not remain untouched by his absence, just as it had not remained untouched by hers. The road stretched forward beneath a pale sky, the last traces of winter fading into damp earth and distant mist, and as the carriage moved beyond the gates, the distance between him and the life he had known began to take shape, not as loss, but as movement, as something that could no longer be reversed. The journey was not long, yet it felt unfamiliar. each mile marked not by scenery, but by the steady presence of a thought he could not dismiss. The memory of her standing by the window, her voice quiet, her presence unassuming, and the realization that what he sought was not merely her return, but the restoration of something that had taken root within him without permission. The countryside unfolded in muted tones, the early signs of spring emerging cautiously from the remnants of frost, and with it came a subtle sense of transition, as though the world itself mirrored the shift he had only just begun to understand. By late afternoon, the path narrowed, the land less defined, and the carriage slowed as the driver turned toward a smaller road, one that led not to a grand estate or a place of significance, but to something far simpler, far quieter, the kind of place she would have gone without expectation of being followed. When the carriage came to a stop, Alexander stepped down without waiting, his gaze moving across the modest surroundings, taking in the small details, the absence of grandeur, the quiet dignity of a place that did not demand recognition. And for the first time, he understood something he had not before, that her presence had never been defined by where she stood, but by what she brought with her. He approached the door with a steady pace, though there was a subtle tension beneath it, not uncertainty, but something closer to anticipation, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. And when he finally raised his hand to knock, the moment held a weight far greater than the simple action required. The door opened slowly, and when Elena stood before him, there was no shock in her expression, no disbelief, only a quiet stillness, as though she had sensed, in some unspoken way, that this moment would come. For a brief second, neither spoke, the distance between them filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had changed, and everything that now stood waiting to be acknowledged. And as he met her gaze, no longer guarded, no longer distant, Alexander realized that whatever had begun within the walls of Whitmore Manor had followed him here, unchanged, undeniable, and no longer something he could leave behind. For a moment, time did not move between them. And in that stillness, everything that had been left unsaid seemed to gather, not as pressure, but as quiet understanding waiting to be acknowledged. Elena stood just inside the doorway, the soft light behind her outlining a life far simpler than the one he had left behind. Yet there was nothing diminished in her presence, nothing uncertain, only that same composed calm that had never once demanded anything from him. Alexander did not step forward immediately, and perhaps that hesitation was the last remnant of the distance he had carried for so long. But when he finally spoke, his voice no longer held the restraint it once had. "I should not have let you leave." The words measured, not dramatic, but carrying a weight that did not need to be raised to be understood. She regarded him quietly, her gaze steady, searching not for explanation, but for truth, and after a moment, she answered, "You did what you believed was right." Her tone gentle, without accusation, without regret, and it would have been easier if she had been anything else, if she had been distant or cold, but she was not. He took a step closer then, closing the space between them by a fraction, enough to change the air, enough to make what remained between them impossible to ignore. "It was not right," he said, more quietly now, as though the admission itself required no audience beyond her. "It was only what I knew." And in that moment, the difference between obligation and understanding became clear in a way he had never allowed before. Her expression softened slightly, not with relief, not with expectation, but with recognition, as though she had already seen this shift long before he had named it. "And now?" she asked, her voice low, not pressing, simply inviting him to continue. And for the first time, he did not retreat from the question. "Now I know that what I left behind was not the house," he said, his gaze holding hers without hesitation. "It was you." And the simplicity of the words carried more truth than anything he had spoken before, stripped of formality, stripped of distance, leaving only what remained when everything else had been set aside. The silence that followed was not uncertain, not fragile, but steady, as though it had been waiting for this moment to take its place. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in hesitation, but in thought, and when she looked at him again, there was something in her expression that had not been there before, something that acknowledged the shift without questioning it. "You do not belong here," she said softly, not as rejection, but as truth. a reminder of the difference between their worlds, the distance that still existed beyond. What had changed between them? He did not deny it, did not dismiss it, because for the first time, it did not feel like a boundary he needed to defend. Then I will not remain where I no longer belong, he replied, his voice steady, certain in a way that came not from duty, but from choice. The meaning of it settled between them slowly, not as a declaration, but as a quiet offering, one that did not demand acceptance, but did not retreat either. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the ground, the last traces of winter giving way to something new, and within that small space, the distance that had once defined them no longer held the same power. Neither moved immediately, neither spoke again. Yet the stillness between them had changed once more, no longer shaped by what had been lost, but by what had been found, something neither had sought, yet neither could now deny. The moment did not break, and neither did they, standing there within the quiet space where neither world fully claimed them, yet neither felt out of place, and for the first time, the distance that had once defined everything between them no longer demanded resolution, only acknowledgement. Elena stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in thought, her gaze steady as she regarded him with that same quiet clarity that had never once faltered. And in that small movement, something shifted again, not away, but forward in a way that required no urgency. You cannot leave everything behind without consequence, she said softly, her voice calm, grounded in a truth neither of them could ignore, and yet there was no resistance in it, only understanding. Alexander did not look away, did not dismiss the weight of her words, because for the first time, consequence did not feel like something to be avoided, but something to be chosen. I have already lived with the consequence of not knowing, he replied, his voice steady, carrying a quiet certainty that had not existed before. I will not choose it again. And in that simple admission, the past he had held so tightly no longer defined the path ahead. The silence that followed was not uncertain, not fragile, but full, as though it had been waiting for this moment to take shape, and Elena's expression softened in a way that spoke not of surrender, but of recognition, the kind that does not come from words alone, but from what has been proven in their absence. Outside, the air had shifted, the last trace of winter giving way to something gentler, the light stretching longer across the ground, as if marking the quiet beginning of something new. And within that small doorway, the boundary between their worlds no longer stood as firmly as it once had. Then do not stand there as though you are still deciding, she said at last, not as a challenge, but as an invitation, her voice low, steady, carrying the same quiet strength that had never once wavered. And for a moment, he simply looked at her, as though committing the truth of that moment to memory, before stepping forward fully, closing the distance that had once seemed unbridgeable. There was no grand gesture, no sudden declaration, only the quiet certainty of presence, the kind that does not need to be proven, because it has already endured. The house behind her remained still, simple, unchanged, yet it no longer felt small, no longer felt separate from the life he had known, because what mattered had never been the walls that held them, but what had passed between them within those walls and beyond them. In the days that followed, nothing shifted all at once. No transformation marked the passage from what had been to what would be, yet everything changed in ways that could not be undone. The manner he returned to no longer silent in the same way, the rooms no longer holding absence, but memory. And when Elena stepped within those halls once more, not as a guest, not as an obligation, but as something chosen, the space itself seemed to recognize her in a way it never had before. Alexander no longer moved through it alone, no longer defined his place within it by distance, but by presence, by the quiet understanding that what had once been guarded had now been opened, not by force, not by need, but by something far deeper, something that had taken root in silence and remained when everything else had fallen away. And in the stillness that followed, no longer empty, no longer cold, the truth settled gently into place, that some lives are not changed by grand moments, but by the quiet persistence of something that refuses to remain only what it was meant to be, and that some hearts do not begin to beat again until they are finally seen, not as they were, but as they have become.